When I handed over my manuscript, I was handing over my soul, only to watch a stranger rewrite my entire existence into a lie. The coffee had gone cold in my hands as I stared at the screen, reading words that were supposed to be mine. Words that carried my voice, my pain, my truth. Instead, what glowed back at me from that laptop screen was something so foreign, so sanitized, so absolutely wrong that I felt physically sick. This was not my story. This was not my life. This was not me. But there it was, published under my name, carrying my photograph on the back cover, claiming to be my memoir. The book I had poured my bleeding heart into had been transformed into something unrecognizable. A glossy, commercial lie that made my trauma digestible for mass consumption. I am Delphine Kruger, and this is the story of how I watched my life get stolen, rewritten, and sold back to me as fiction. This is also the story of how I took it all back and served the coldest revenge imaginable. Let me take you back to where it all began. Amsterdam in October can break your heart with its beauty. The canals reflect the golden light of autumn, and the city breathes with a rhythm that feels ancient and eternal. I was sitting in my cramped apartment above a cheese shop, surrounded by years of notes, journals, photographs, and memories that I had finally decided to transform into something meaningful. My memoir. The book that would tell the world about the chaos, the beauty, the absolute devastation and resurrection of my life. I had lived through things that should have killed me. A near-death accident when I was 19 that left me in a coma for 3 weeks. A childhood spent bouncing between countries like a pinball, Netherlands, Germany, Morocco, back to Amsterdam, always following whatever parent or guardian could handle me that year. I had survived trauma that carved itself into my bones, depression that felt like drowning while everyone around me continued breathing. But I had also survived. More than that, I had rebuilt myself from the fragments, piece by bloody piece, until I became someone who could tell the story. Someone who could write the words that might help another person feel less alone in their own darkness. Sea glass and gunpowder. That was what I called my memoir. Sea glass because trauma, like ocean waves, can take something sharp and broken and slowly, painfully, transform it into something beautiful. Gunpowder because sometimes survival requires explosive force. The manuscript was raw. It was real. It was 3 years of my life poured onto 400 pages, every word fought for, every sentence earned through tears and therapy, and the kind of brutal honesty that feels like surgery without anesthesia. When I finished it, I knew it was good. Not perfect. First drafts never are, but authentic in a way that felt dangerous and necessary. I could feel the power in those words, the way they pulse with life and pain and hope. That was when I made the mistake that would nearly destroy everything. I decided to work with a traditional publisher. The publishing house was impressive. Glass offices in London, awards covering the walls, editors with pedigrees that read like literary royalty. They were interested in my story, they said. Very interested. But they wanted to pair me with one of their best editors to help shape the narrative and maximize commercial appeal. Enter Catherine Weller. Catherine was British in the way that some people are aggressively, performatively British. She wore her accent like armor, and her reputation like a crown. Mid-40s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had never had a hair out of place in her entire life. She sipped gin and tonic during our first meeting at 11 in the morning, and smiled with the warmth of January in Siberia. Delphine, she said, pronouncing my name with the kind of precision that made it sound foreign even to me. Your story has potential. Real potential. But we are going to need to do some work here. I nodded eagerly. I was young in the publishing world, naive about how these things worked. I thought some work meant fixing grammar, smoothing transitions, maybe restructuring a few chapters. I thought editors were there to make your words clearer, not to change them entirely. The trauma sections are quite intense, Catherine continued, making notes in red ink across my pages. We will need to soften some of these rough edges. Make it more palatable. More inspirational. You know, commercial. Commercial. That word should have been my first warning. She took my manuscript home that night, promising to have notes ready within a week. When she returned it, I almost did not recognize my own work. Entire chapters had been rewritten. My voice, the voice I had spent years finding, had been replaced by something smoother, safer, completely artificial. The chapter about my mother, where I had written honestly about her struggles with addiction and our complicated relationship, had been completely removed. Just gone. As if the most influential person in my life had never existed. The breakdown I had experienced in Marrakesh, where I had spent 3 weeks unable to leave my hotel room, battling thoughts that scared me, had been transformed into a creative sabbatiel where I discovered the beauty of solitude. A creative sabbatical. As if I had been on some kind of spiritual retreat instead of fighting for my mental health. But the worst part, the thing that made my stomach turn and my hands shake, was the final chapter she had added. A chapter where I found healing through love. Specifically, through a relationship with a man who had never existed in my life. She had literally invented a boyfriend for me, complete with meaningful conversations and healing embraces, and all the romance novel tropes that make trauma survivors want to scream. This gives readers hope, Catherine explained when I called her, my voice barely controlled. It shows them that love can heal all wounds. But it is not true, I said. None of this is true. You have rewritten my entire life. Publishing is a business, Delphine, she replied with that same cold smile. We need to give readers what they want. And what they want is hope, inspiration, and a happy ending. Your original version is simply too dark. Too dark. My life was too dark for my own memoir. She had taken my story, my real, messy, complicated, painful, beautiful story, and whitewashed it into something that could sit comfortably on a bookstore shelf next to other, inspirational memoirs, without making anyone uncomfortable. She had turned my truth into a lie and called it improvement. I signed the contract anyway. I was young, I was scared, and I believed that being published by a prestigious house was worth the compromise. I told myself that at least my story would reach people, even if it was not entirely my story anymore. The book was released 6 months later to modest success. It sold reasonably well, got a few positive reviews that praised its uplifting message and inspirational journey. Reading those reviews felt like watching strangers praise someone else while wearing my face. I did interviews where I had to pretend that this sanitized version was actually my experience. I smiled and nodded when radio hosts called me inspiring for overcoming trauma through the power of love. I felt like a fraud, a liar, a person who had sold her soul for a book deal. But the worst part was the messages I received from readers. People who had experienced their own trauma reached out to tell me how disappointed they were that I had glossed over the hard parts and focused so much on romance. Survivors who had hoped to find someone who understood their darkness instead found another book telling them that love was the answer to everything. I had let them down. I had let myself down. I had allowed Catherine Weller to take my truth and transform it into just another feel-good story that did nothing to help the people who needed it most. That was when I decided to fight back. It took me 3 months to find the right lawyer. Someone who specialized in publishing contracts and intellectual property rights. Someone who understood that this was about more than money. This was about artistic integrity and the right to tell your own story. The legal battle was brutal. Catherine and the publishing house fought every step of the way, claiming that the edited version was simply an improvement on my original work, and that I had signed away my rights to creative control. They had teams of lawyers and decades of experience in these battles. But I had something they did not expect: documentation. I had saved every email, every phone call transcript, every revision note that showed exactly how extensively they had altered my work. I had proof that the published version bore almost no resemblance to the manuscript I had submitted. More importantly, I had determination fueled by rage. The kind of rage that burns clean and bright, and does not fade when things get difficult. 7 months and most of my savings later, I bought back the rights to my own story. The day I signed those papers, getting back legal ownership of sea glass and gunpowder, I cried for an hour. Not from sadness, but from relief. My story belonged to me again. Now came the real work. I went back to my original manuscript, the raw, honest, complicated version that Catherine had deemed too dark. I spent another 6 months working on it, not to make it more commercial, but to make it truer. I added chapters one had been too scared to write the first time. I dug deeper into the pain, the confusion, the slow and imperfect process of healing. I wrote about my mother's addiction honestly, including the ways it had shaped my own relationship with substances and control. I wrote about the breakdown in Marrakesh in all its terrifying detail, because I knew there were people who needed to hear that sometimes healing involves completely falling apart first. I wrote about the loneliness of recovery, the way trauma changes your relationships, the fact that there is no magical moment when everything becomes okay. I wrote about the ongoing work of staying alive and finding meaning in a world that had tried to break me. And I absolutely did not write about finding healing through some fictional romantic relationship. Instead, I wrote about the harder truth, that healing happens inside you, through your own work, with the support of friends and professionals, and sometimes medication, and always the daily choice to keep going. When the manuscript was finished, really finished this time, I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to self-publish through a small indie house in Amsterdam that actually read the books they printed. A company run by people who believe that stories should be true first and commercial second. The difference in how I was treated was staggering. Instead of being told my story was too dark, I was told it was powerful. Instead of having my trauma rewritten into something comfortable, I was asked how they could best honor the difficulty of what I had lived through. They designed a cover that actually reflected the content. Not some sunset and beach nonsense, but something that looked like sea glass catching light through storm clouds. They wrote marketing copy that did not promise easy answers or happy endings, but rather honest exploration of what it means to survive and rebuild. The book was published on a Tuesday in March. By Thursday, it was trending on Dutch social media. By the end of the week, it had hit the Dutch bestseller list. The response was unlike anything I had experienced with the original publication. People were not just reading it, they were talking about it, sharing it, thanking me for telling the truth about trauma and recovery. Survivors reached out to tell me that finally, someone had written about the real experience of healing, not the sanitized version that gets sold in bookstores. Within 2 months, it had been translated into 7 languages. I was invited to speak at conferences, interviewed by major publications, asked to write essays about trauma and recovery for magazines around the world. NPR featured me on their morning show. The Guardian wrote a full-page review calling it brutally honest and ultimately hopeful in the way that only truth can be. I was invited to keynote at a trauma writing symposium in Buenos Aires, where I spoke to a room full of survivors and therapists and writers about the importance of telling our stories exactly as we lived them. The success was intoxicating, but more than that, it felt right. This was what I had wanted from the beginning. For my story to reach people who needed it, in all its complicated, uncomfortable, real truth. But I was not done with Catherine Weller yet. In the final chapter of my memoir, I included a single footnote. Page 276, to be exact. It appears after a paragraph where I discuss the importance of finding editors and publishers who respect your voice and your story. The footnote reads, not to be confused with the unauthorized early edition, edited beyond recognition by one CW, whose contribution is best forgotten. That was it. No full name. No detailed explanation. No angry rant about what she had done to my work. Just one cold clinical line that acknowledged her existence only to dismiss it entirely. I could have written pages about Catherine Weller, and how she had nearly destroyed my book. I could have named her fully, detailed every change she had made, turned her into a villain in my story. Instead, I made her a footnote. Literally. Because here is what I learned through this entire experience. The most devastating revenge is not always the loudest one. Sometimes, the cruelest thing you can do to someone who has tried to erase your voice is to reduce them to a single, forgettable line in your story. Catherine Weller, with all her prestigious reputation and industry connections, became one sentence that most readers would probably skip right over. She was relegated to the bottom of a page, in smaller font, easily ignored. That footnote accomplished something that pages of anger never could have. It put her in exactly the place she belonged in my story. Nowhere important. The response to the book was everything I had hoped for and more. But the moment that made everything worth it came 6 months after publication, when I received a message that made me laugh out loud. It was from a nervous-sounding intern working at Catherine Weller's new boutique editing firm. Apparently, Catherine had started her own company after leaving the publishing house where we had worked together. The message read, Hello, Ms. Kruger. I hope this finds you well. Ms. Weller was wondering if you would consider allowing her to represent your next book project. She has followed your recent success with great interest and believes she could help you reach an even wider audience. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling a mixture of disbelief and amusement. After everything that had happened, after I had bought back my rights and republished my story specifically to undo what she had done to it, Catherine Weller wanted to work with me again. The audacity was breathtaking. I crafted my response very carefully. I did not write a long explanation of why I would never work with her again. I did not detail the ways she had betrayed my trust and damaged my work. Instead, I replied with a single screenshot, the footnote from page 276 of my memoir, and nothing else. I never heard back from that intern. The success of Sea Glass and Gunpowder changed my life in ways I am still discovering. I have been able to quit my day job and focus on writing full-time. I am working on a second book, a novel this time, with an editor who respects my voice and treats my words like they matter. More importantly, I have heard from hundreds of trauma survivors who found something in my story that helped them feel less alone. People who told me that reading about the real, messy process of healing gave them permission to stop pretending their own recovery was simple or linear. That is what I wanted from the beginning. Not commercial success, although that has been wonderful. Not revenge against Catherine Weller, although that footnote still makes me smile. What I wanted was to tell the truth about what it means to survive trauma and rebuild your life from the pieces. And I did it. Not despite Catherine Weller's attempt to sanitize my story, but because of it. She taught me something valuable about the publishing industry and about the importance of fighting for your own voice. She also taught me that sometimes the people who claim to know best how to tell your story are exactly the people you should never trust with it. Looking back now, I can see that losing control of my memoir was one of the most painful and ultimately most valuable experiences of my writing career. It forced me to confront what I really believed about storytelling, authenticity, and the responsibility writers have to their readers. It also gave me one of the most satisfying moments of my professional life. Reducing someone who tried to erase my voice to a single, dismissive footnote in my own story. Catherine Weller wanted to make my memoir commercial and palatable. Instead, she taught me the value of staying raw and real and uncomfortably honest. She wanted to give me a happy ending with a fictional boyfriend. Instead, she gave me something better. The knowledge that I could fight for my own story and win. She wanted to soften my rough edges and make my trauma digestible for mass consumption. Instead, she showed me exactly the kind of editor I never wanted to work with again. In trying to rewrite my story, Catherine Weller accidentally taught me the most important lesson of my writing career. Your voice matters, your truth matters, and no one has the right to change your story without your permission. Now, when young writers ask me for advice about working with editors and publishers, I tell them about Catherine Weller. Not by name, she remains just CW in my stories, relegated to footnote status even in my conversations about her. I tell them to trust their instincts, to fight for their voice, and to remember that being published is not worth losing yourself in the process. And I tell them that sometimes the most powerful response to someone who tries to silence you is not to shout louder, but to tell your story so clearly and truthfully that their attempts to change it become obviously wrong. My memoir is still selling well, still reaching people who need to hear that healing is possible even when it is not pretty or simple or commercially appealing. It has been optioned for a documentary, translated into 12 languages now, and used in therapy programs around the world. Catherine Weller remains a footnote. And that, I think, is exactly as it should be. If this story of fighting for creative control and reclaiming your own narrative resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of justice, revenge, and standing up for what is right. Your support helps us continue sharing these powerful tales of real people who refused to let others rewrite their truth.